Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. It is Friday, December 16th. This is our last show of 2022. So we thought it might be good to look back at the big stories of 2022 and how they may or may not shape the world of 2023. Here to talk about all of this are Karen DeYoung, senior national security correspondent at the Washington Post. Hi, Karen.
Hi.
And Steve Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Steve, great to see you.
You too.
And from snow-bound London, Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon, great to see you as well. Karen, let's start with you and really the biggest story of all, Ukraine, the war, its impact on not only the people, but particularly the people in Ukraine, but the people of Europe, the people around the world. Clearly the biggest news story of all. What struck you about this story that you think is sort of changed the way we look at the world and what it may do in 2023?
Thanks, Ivo. You know, I was thinking about this, and for many of us, particularly in this business, we've been through so many geopolitical crises over the decades, and things that we thought were going to change the way the world works, and basically they didn't. And we've all been living in the post-Cold War world, but this one I think seems a bit different. I think the changes will resonate, if not forever, perhaps for the rest of all of our lifetimes. I think there's a good chance of that. Let me just hit sort of on the kind of high points, and then any of us can pick up things that we think are particularly resonant. It certainly affects the international economy, our system of alliances, globalization, energy, and how we use it. As you said, the deepest changes obviously are in Ukraine. We just saw overnight, after one of the biggest missile barrages of the past 2 months, much of the country's without electricity, water, heat. The question is whether the Ukrainians' own resilience and Western aid can get enough lights back on to keep people from dying. In a macro sense, I think what's happened over the past 2 months has radically changed the projections of what Ukraine will need to survive, even when the war is over. 2 months ago, the projection was that they would need about $55 billion next year just to sort of get themselves up and running again. I think now that projection is completely tossed to the floor. The economy is going to contract by at least a third, probably more this year, and will probably be more next year. You've got basically an industrial agricultural country that simply doesn't work anymore. Its industrial infrastructure has been destroyed, and the question is whether it's even survivable as a viable 21st century enterprise. I think the economic front is now as much a front for the Russians as the actual battlefield is, and it's one where they're having a lot more success than they're having on the battlefield. Some donor nations are starting to think about reconstruction and who's going to pay for it. And even before the last 2 months of all this destruction, the World Bank was estimated the reconstruction costs would be about $350 billion. And the question is, who's going to pay for that? All of this obviously is dependent on the outcome of the war and also on Western staying power. With the Russian economy, the effects are perhaps not quite as visible, but certainly a longer-term problem in terms of Russia's position in the world. When they put the heaviest sanctions on very early in the war in March, a lot of people thought the Russian economy would just collapse, but of course it didn't, because they continued oil and gas exports. The assessment now, I think, is that it'll be a slower sort of implosion as supply chain problems, lack of tech, lack of supplies for the about 50% of the economy that doesn't depend on oil and gas exports, starts to see less and less ability to produce. You've got industries that can't get raw materials or spare parts, agriculture that can't export, and this major role that Russia was playing in a globalized economy, both as an importer and an exporter, is just gradually disappearing. I think, Russia had moved beyond the sort of bad old days that we all remember, where whenever you went to visit somebody in Moscow, you carried extra suitcases full of stuff that they couldn't get. And those days were well behind, but I think they probably are going to return to some degree. Their GDP is going to fall probably around 5% this year. And long term, probably be down at least 10%. So when you listen to people inside Russia, to the extent we're able to ascertain that, the consensus is that none of this is going to stop as long as Putin remains alive and remains in power. I think people who know a lot more than I do say, if that were to happen, it would happen very quickly and unexpectedly, and we're not going to know when it's about to happen. But I think that most people say it's probably unlikely. And then again, somebody new might be somebody worse from our perspective. On the global economy, the impact is primarily on energy and agricultural commodities. There's been a lot written about those effects. It's pushed global attention, at least in the West, more toward climate change and an end to reliance on fossil fuels, more toward renewables. The East and West are competing for support from the global South, and you saw that with the Africa conference this week in Washington, along with the terrible traffic it caused. I think that we're paying more attention to them than we have in years. I think that the world is starting to go back to more of a block system, and people are trying to position themselves as to which side they're going to be on. But at the same time, countries like the United States and Europe have a lot less power to coerce for what we want, and a need to create more partnerships. For the Western powers, obviously, they see the need to stick more together. It's made NATO stronger. That's become kind of axiomatic, and make ourselves as an alliance and as individual countries more self-sufficient in terms of supply lines and technology. There's also been a revamping of military plans, both in this country, in NATO, and in the individual NATO plans. We've seen ourselves running out of stuff. There have been a lot of assessments of our strategy and our own supply lines, the defense industry, saying that, if we had this kind of conventional war with China using precision weaponry, that we wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 weeks. We'd just run out of stuff. I think there's a realization that trench warfare in Europe is not dead. We sort of spent our time over the past 10, 15, 20 years devoted to how to combat terrorism, devoted to space, high-tech weaponry, things that, big ticket items that pleased members of Congress, and not the sort of basic supplies that we need. And I think there'll be more attention paid to that. It'll speed up pressure on NATO's members toward interoperability and complementary defense manufacturing, more you do this, you do that, and so that you don't have 5, 10 countries all producing a different version of the same thing. That would be the ideal. Everybody's always given lip service to that. The question is whether or not this experience will push people more toward it. For the East, I think while China may not be happy with what Russia's doing in Ukraine, it still needs Russian energy and geopolitical support. And I think it sees Russia as a useful tool for its own ambitions. So what could throw a monkey wrench in all of this? The Russians could decide to go nuclear. The Russians could decide to withdraw. China could see an opportunity with the West distracted to move on Taiwan. I think we've seen that the United States is not prepared to fight a two-front war at this point. Political divisions in the United States, economic downturns could all derail plans for increased dependence on each other, could also undercut ongoing and sustained support for Ukraine. They could undermine what the Biden administration has said is a focus on competition rather than confrontation with China, and on accelerated energy transformation. I think, or in the West, in this country and in Europe, we could all simply grow really tired of what are seen as unacceptable and unavoidable sacrifices and just retreat back into ourselves.
A huge volume, in part because the things it is something that actually is affecting everything. I think rightly starting off with affecting Ukraine and Russia, the direct participants and the people on the ground. Karen really laid it all out here. Thanks for that, Gideon. Pick up on any or all or pieces that sort of stick with you looking back. Almost, we're 10 months into this war, and it's sort of bigger impact on things that we've been observing.
Thanks, Ivo. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, in some ways, obviously Karen is right. This war's changed the world enormously. But in some ways, it seems to me to have also kind of reasserted certain verities that we thought maybe we were moving beyond, in the sense that it's a very traditional Western response, the US all in, rather than, saying, as one might have thought it might have done, say, in the Trump era or in certain moods in the Obama period, Europe's got to deal with this. On the contrary, not only was the US all in, Europe, which is in every crisis says, maybe this is the time we're going to take the lead, actually takes its lead from the United States, which is the kind of key organizer. And secondly, I think that one of the reasons this may have happened is that there's been a growing narrative over some years of Western retreat, Western weakness, that I think Putin himself believed, that Xi believes, and that was reinforced, if anything, by the Afghanistan debacle just 6 months or so before Putin's decision to invade. And that has been slightly arrested by the way this war has gone. The West has been more unified. Russia's been, much, much weaker than we thought militarily. China looks a bit more confused. So I think one hesitates to say that anything good could come out of some sort of brutal war. Millions of refugees, thousands of people dead, including civilians, cities devastated. It's ghastly. But in the sort of, if you're looking at the world from, London or Washington, I'd guess, I think you probably think we end the year in a better place than when we began it, certainly than we feared we would be a week into the war, where I think people thought Putin would win very quickly. And if he had and occupied Ukraine, who knows how that would have shifted the balance of power in Asia, what Xi's calculations might then have been. And to conclude, I think the other thing that maybe is a bit new is that we're ending the year with a slightly enlarged view of what I call a kind of global West, where there's been a long-standing debate, I think, in America about where should the US put its emphasis? Should it pivot to Asia? Is it maybe leave Europe to look after itself? Should it move away from the Middle East or something? And now I think people are moving towards, I don't know how feasible it will be, but a sense of there being a sort of single integrated global theater where you try to introduce Asian allies as players in the West, so that Japan, South Korea, Australia attend the NATO summit, where you try to get Europeans to take a bit more interest in Asia. You can see that in the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US security agreement, and where a lot of these global challenges that are not just hard security, things like technology, that all of these sort of like-minded democracies are going to have to work together to try to come up with, say, technological solutions that set global standards. So I think it's, it's an interesting moment in the kind of revival of the West. And the last piece I would say is that, crucial to the idea of a strong West is a strong United States domestically as well as internationally. I mean, the US cannot lead the fight for democracy around the world if its democracy at home is crumbling. And again, at the beginning of the year, it looked quite bad. Biden's ratings were terrible. Trump was on the rise again. But I think the midterms do seem to have deflated the Trump bubble. And maybe the crisis in American democracy is past its worst point. And that too has global significance.
I think your overall point of verities coming through once again that we seem to have forgotten, well taken, and of course the importance of American leadership as part of that and what that really means is critical. I mean, one other verity I put on the table, and Steve, I don't want to comment on this or anything else, is the return of military power as an instrument of statecraft. Certainly in the West, we thought that we were so dominant that when we used it, everything would just come to our, we would win. Turned out that wasn't the case in two of our last wars. But more importantly, than in places like Europe, you just wouldn't have this anymore. It wouldn't happen. And I think, as Karen rightly said, we have trench warfare. It's an early 20th century kind of warfare. It just happens to be with more sophisticated weapons, but in some ways not that different from what we've seen. And we're drawing lessons from the Napoleonic, or certainly World War I and World War II, for what is happening. That's a verity that we thought wasn't the case either. But Steve, pick up here.
Well, first, two very, very good contributions and a very good question. I mean, I'm very struck by the psychological change. It's almost a transformation that's beginning. It's not solid yet. I think it will have to continue, particularly among young Europeans in West Europe in particular, who've had, under the age of even 50, who've had 30 years of basically peace, where they thought war was something else, and it was in
and
Africa.
Prosperity.
Yeah, and prosperity, and cheap energy from Russia and cheap manufacturing in China, and just this assumption that Europe could continue being the Musée Doré, the sort of golden museum that lived on soft power and kind of kept talking about the language of power without actually doing anything about it. That's still a problem. But I think suddenly people have looked up and realized that defense spending is going up. It's going to go up for a long time. Their mortgage rates are going to go up, and they're going to be there for a long time. The cost of energy is going up. Inflation, they may be able to manage in the next couple of years. And they're not even in the war. But it is something of a shock. At the same time, it is really, we're saying that for a big part of the world, this is a regional war. It's not their war. They don't want any part of it. They don't want to be committed to it. I mean, they're still, if you're in Asia, you're still looking at what China's doing. You're still very much aware of economic power. And Russia was never that big an issue for you anyway. I mean, the Indians will have to find better weapons to buy. But to some degree, what worries me is this war for the West. Let's, not underestimate what's going on inside Ukraine right now. But for the West, I think it's almost like providing an answer to the dilemma of what the West is and what it was and what it was for. Certainly that's true of NATO. And so we'll see what comes out of it. I worry, I've said this before, but this war is going to go on a long time. I have no indication Russia's about to give up. It's not the mood I hear from friends there. It's not what you hear from Vladimir Putin. The Economist just did a very good briefing this week talking to Ukrainian generals. They expect the war to go on. They expect a big Russian counteroffensive. They don't think the Russians are stupid. They don't, it's not an easy war, and it's not going to end very easily. And then we have all these questions that we really don't want to ask. I mean, I just heard Jake Sullivan go on for an hour at Carnegie saying almost nothing at all of substance about how the war ends and what kind of security guarantees Ukraine's going to need to survive. If it's going to be rebuilt, every day the war goes on, the cost of rebuilding goes up. And who's going to pay? Very much Karen's question. But will private investment happen without Ukraine being a member of NATO? These are questions nobody really wants to talk about. So I think, as we look at what we've learned this year, I think we've suppressed a lot of the important questions that are out there. And we shouldn't be too happy about the situation in the West, because it can crack very easily, in my pessimistic view.
I think, Steve, you, like everyone else, has put on the table all the questions we still need to answer in the year to come. So the good news, at least, is we have things to talk about when it comes to Ukraine for 2023. The bad news is that as long as this war continues, the suffering and the consequences will be virtually all negative, even though we've seen some of the positives, but they certainly will be negative for the people of Ukraine in some way. Let's go to the Gideon to sort of the next big thing, and they're in some ways, because Ukraine has been so dominant, they're part of the same storyline, but we're also living in the same, talking about the same year, the same era. You wrote a book, came out early this year, called The Age of the Strongmen, and a thesis that I think many of us were bought into, that we had strongmen leaders, and they were all men, by the way. So you were right on that. But when you look at those leaders now at the end of the year, one of them is out of power, Bolsonaro. Another one is out of power, Johnson. A third is hawking Superman cards, Donald Trump, or whatever it is that he's hawking right now. Russia may be strong, but or still led by, but not as capable. And if you'd have to rewrite the book, would it be The Age of the Weak Men, or how would you characterize it today? Where do you think we are?
Well, funnily enough, I've been having to revise the paperback right now. And the thing about these books is they, as you know, if you write a current affairs book, it goes out of date the minute you kind of finish it. But I remember actually it was more or less this time of year last year that I was finishing the manuscript, and I was conscious that it was pretty depressing. It was like a story of 20 years of rollback of democracy around the world, which you could see in the statistics as well as in the kind of individual stories of people like Putin and Xi and so on, and the emergence of these strongman leaders. And so I tried to end on a vaguely optimistic note. It was only vaguely optimistic, saying, this is a very flawed model of leadership, and eventually it will begin to crumble because strongman leaders lose touch with reality. They don't have checks and balances. They eventually make mistakes. But I then added, although it will come to a close, there may be a lot of violence and suffering before it does. And, I didn't know that within like 2 months, that would more or less start to come true, because Putin, who had been regarded, I think up until then, as ruthless, but actually quite shrewd, makes this catastrophic blunder, miscalculation, invading Ukraine. And I think he does begin to undermine the prestige of the strongman model in doing so. a lot of people wouldn't like to be reminded, but that Putin had a big Western fan club. Trump called him a genius 2 days before the invasion. I think Giuliani said after the annexation of Crimea, that's what you call leadership. And there were fans in Italy, in France, Marine Le Pen, Salvini, in Asia, and so on. And Putin now looks not only immoral, but also unsuccessful, a loser to some extent. So that is positive. And I think that the other most important strongman leader in the world is Xi. And he too, it looked like this was going to be his year of absolute affirmation. In a certain sense, it has been. He's got his third term. He's probably set to rule for life. But he's obviously mishandled zero COVID. They've had the biggest demonstrations in China, albeit over, only 2 days, and then it flared down again, since Tiananmen. They're chaotic. Their withdrawal from zero COVID. So he too doesn't look so great. And as you point out, some of the, I think one of the interesting things about the strongman style, which is a cult of personality, nationalism, is that it spans both democracies and autocracies. And the ones in autocracies, you can't really get rid of very easily. So Xi and Putin can stumble, mess up, but they're still there. Some of the ones in democracies, as you point out, Bolsonaro lost. And interestingly, having sort of threatened to do a Trump, was obviously preparing the ground to say the elections are fraudulent and to dispute them. Brazilian institutions actually turned out to be arguably more resilient and reliable than American institutions, in that the courts and the military kind of squashed all that in 24 hours, and he's had to leave. On the other hand, it's never going to be a clean sweep. I mean, Trump, you guys know about, and he's obviously in trouble. But I think a couple of the strongmen had reasonably good years. Orban, who we thought might lose, won quite, I think, he rigged the system a bit, but I think he did win the most votes, no doubt about it. Possibly a beneficiary of the Ukraine war and the sort of sense that people didn't want to take a risk in Hungary with a kind of unstable coalition. And Netanyahu, who I would also put in the strongman category, has engineered a comeback and is about to take power again. And actually MBS, who started the year in some trouble, I think, very concerned about where Biden would the confrontation with the United States. But because of the Ukraine war, Saudi's hand is much stronger than it was, because energy producers are in good shape. And MBS ends the year rather confident, able to diss Biden, to welcome Xi Jinping to Riyadh and so on. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts, but I think overall, the strongman phenomenon is looking less compelling as a proposition than it did at the beginning, which is great.
Karen, one other leader, of course, Erdoğan, who fits the bill too, and we don't quite know what's going to happen in 2023. There's going to be parliamentary and presidential elections in Turkey. He is trying to lock up all of his opponents, including the mayor of Istanbul, right as we speak. But Karen, if how do you look at this model? Does it still make sense to think about in the terms that Gideon laid out? Do you think we are in a sort of a transition where, in fact, the sheen of autocracy is come off a little bit, in part because of what Russia has undergone because of Putin, and the zero COVID piece, which is only going to get worse, or the COVID piece in China in some ways, at least in the next few months. You were reading about criticisms from Chinese people about the sudden change that is happening all the time. How do you where do you think we're at in this?
Well, I think Erdoğan is a really interesting case study in this. I mean, virtually everything he does now, both in terms of international policy and domestic policy, is focused on his re-election campaign and what he thinks will be most beneficial to him. He's trying to position himself so that, as you say, the opposition is both split or in prison. He's weighing the benefits or drawbacks of another military incursion into Syria. He's trying more than anybody to balance between Russia and the United States in terms of Ukraine, which is the sort of litmus test now for where you stand in the world. And I think we just don't know how it's going to work out. I mean, presumably people in Turkey will vote on the economy, which is the thing that most affects their individual lives, which is not good at the moment. You never know with Erdoğan whether he's going to find something at the last minute, something to sort of give it enough of a boost that he can get over the finish line. I think that feels like he's got the Americans a bit over a barrel right now. They're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't in terms of trying to stand up to him. He's made himself a key player in the whole commodities issue with Ukraine in terms of the grain shipments. There's still a lot of things he wants from the United States in terms of defense supplies and lifting of sanctions. He's got really no friends in the American Congress, and that's a dilemma for the Biden administration in terms of how much they want to keep him on board. We'll see what he does with the Swedish membership of NATO, where he wants to make points on what he says is their harboring of Kurdish terrorists. I think the Swedes have gone a pretty good distance and will probably go a little bit more in order to make that work, because the rest of NATO really wants it. So I think that'll be a really good litmus test, in the same way as Gideon said Brazil has been, and where the Turkish military stands, which I don't think we really know the answer to that now.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The other thing, but just on Bolsonaro and the thing, turns out you can actually count your votes in 3 hours and know the result, which is what happened in Brazil. And if you actually want to have a stable democracy, that's probably a really important thing, is to have a result quickly. It's part of the problem that we had, of course, in 2020. It's in some ways the problem we had even in the midterms, not knowing the result for weeks or at least days. Is a problem. Steve, I'm conscious of time. I want you to talk about your sense of what happened to the age of the strongmen, but also maybe pick up on our third sort of theme, which is the revival of the West, as in some ways that has come out of here. And just to think about it, it was only 3 years ago that Putin in the Financial Times interviews said that liberalism is obsolete. It was very much this idea that we, the strong men, are on the rise, and you, the decadent, divided, and weak West, are on the offensive. Doesn't seem that way right now. Seems a little different.
Yes, it does, but I have to tease you first, because in Enver Hoxha's Albania, you had really early results that came in very early, and they were quite clear. So I'm not sure that's the standard that I would use for democracy.
Yes, you're right.
No, I mean,
technology, that's what you need. The Brazilians have technology.
Right, exactly. You would just put chips in our heads. No, what I'm very struck by, I mean, I read Gideon's book with great interest, and I mean, basically, autocracies tend to have strong leaders. I mean, then the interesting thing is when democracies do, like Modi in India, Erdoğan, sort of a democracy, pretty much. I mean, I'm not sure he's going to let himself lose the presidency, but he might lose the majority in parliament, which would be very interesting. And then you have people like Kaczynski in Poland, and they have elections this year too. So I guess, just to save time, what I would mostly say is, Iran is very interesting. In a way, you have a strong leader system there. We don't know how ill Khamenei is, but they're not very they're brittle. That's the problem with autocracies. They don't seem to be flexible the way democracies are. Democracies are messier, but they tend to kind of bend rather than break. And it's been very interesting to see in China, loosening up on COVID. That's a big blow. But at the same time, what will happen to the death tolls will be really interesting to see. What happens to the Iran protests? I mean, even if they're crushed, I think people will remember this for quite a long time. So, we tend to think, we need the state. in times of crisis. But democratic states seem just better able to cope in the long run. So I guess I would simply leave it there, but it also goes to the other theme, which is, as you said, the revival of the West. I mean, in a way, the West never went away, and the West is shrinking, right? I mean, that's simply the case. I mean, looking at the rise of China, which is inexorable no matter what happens, and shouldn't be stopped. And then, I mean, there are ways to deter China, but not contain it. I think that's too big a challenge. And you look at India and so on. The West is shrinking, and we keep saying we have universal values, but I've never believed in universal values. I mean, the Asians don't have the same values. They have their own values, which are perfectly legitimate and also moral and so on, but it's not exactly the same. And collective societies are different. So the West has revived, it's true. I mean, I'm most struck by the question we keep asking is, Joe Biden, the last transatlanticist alive, and will he be the oddity to an America whose foreign policy is really become more self-absorbed, more nationalist? Seems to me global trade is in trouble. We call it resilience. I think maybe the better word is protectionism. I'm not sure that's really good, but we'll see. I think it's inevitable. But you do have in Europe the European Union, which really has responded in better ways than I thought it would be able to do. Now, partly because the Biden people encouraged them and petted them and said all the nicest possible things and listened to them and so on, which is what everybody wants. But also they did pull together a really important sanctions regime on Russia. And if you look at Kiel Institute figures on contributions for Ukraine, if you combine military and financial, Europe has now given more to Ukraine than the United States, not so much militarily, but if you include financial contributions too. So I think we're in this together, and I think it's very important. And what worries me only is that we hold together, which is going to be a long haul. But I think people have realized that, as I tell Germans, threats to Germany are much more important than mixing brown glass and green glass, that there really are difficulties in the world and enemies. And I think this has been an important lesson. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I think it is a lesson, and it is a rethinking of how one operates in the world. And you're seeing that only in Germany with the Zeitenwende, as it's called, but also the Japanese government has just announced a doubling of defense spending over the next 5 years. Just an understanding that things are changing. And I guess, Karen, the worries that we've had is, and I think Steve mentioned it, is that nationalism would make it more and more difficult for all of us to collaborate, particularly if the United States becomes more nationalist. Do you see this as a momentary blip in a longer story where the West is, in fact, more and more divided over time? Or is this a time where people have refound the West as a entity that if we don't stick together, all of us are going to suffer? Where do you think that balance is at the moment, and what should we be looking for in the year ahead to see where the balance is moving?
I think a lot of it depends on what happens in American politics. I think that if we returned to something akin to Trumpism without Trump, I think, as Steve said, I think it's all pretty fragile, that things could fall apart pretty quickly. because everybody has sympathy for Ukraine. You look at public opinion in Europe and public opinion in this country. Yes, everybody has sympathy. But when it really starts to hurt, and it's already hurting quite a bit, then I think that the possibility of things starting to unravel is pretty strong. And it'll be, the next 2 years will be just so interesting and so crucial. If you see in this country, I think right now, I guess I would say Trump would not be the nominee, but somebody in his image probably will be, whether that's DeSantis or somebody else. Whether Biden, the signs are fairly good, if you leave aside the stock market today, that the U.S. economy is going slowly in the right direction. If there's enough that the Democrats can claim next year that all of this pain and all of the things that they did took the country back in the right direction, and if the Democrats can get theirselves together to either nominate Biden without a lot of Sturm und Drang, which I think is a big question, or somebody else without a lot of Sturm und Drang, and that person is as committed a transatlantic person as Biden is, then I think you can make progress. But I agree, it's very, very fragile. People are inevitably going to start looking after their own interests. Right now, they can say, yes, our interest is not to have a war in Europe. And not to go back to the sort of might makes right kind of World War II mentality that we've seen before. But I don't think that's assured by any means.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's very uncertain, and it feels very uncertain, even though things have happened that nobody thought was likely to happen, starting with the war and the response.
I think everybody gets it. They get what the moment is. But
but what does that really mean, Gideon? Last word to you on when you look at 2023. What are you going to be looking at in terms of whether the West solidifies? You made the really important point that it's becoming more global. It is less transatlantic or even trans-Pacific. It really is bringing together North America, Europe, and Asia in terms of the democratic, like-minded countries in this response. I mentioned Japan's increase in defense spending in part as a result of this war, which is happening in Europe. How do you look at it?
Well, I think one of the things I'll be really interested in is even that enough? Is the global West enough to have the heft to shape the world, to mold the environment in which China and Russia are then forced to operate? Because having, maybe started on a fairly triumphalist note about, how strong the global West is, I think for me, 3 of the most interesting trips I've taken this year have been to what we slightly ludicrously call the global South, to South Africa, to Indonesia, and just recently to Qatar, where admittedly I was mainly watching football. But the attitudes in those places are very different. The South Africans and the Indonesians I found startlingly sympathetic to Russia. And I think partly because they don't actually like a unipolar world. They don't like a moralistic America. I don't share their views, but this is what you hear. And equally, across the piece, they don't really buy the idea necessarily of universal values. It was interesting being in Qatar, talking to the Qataris about the whole row about gay rights. And they were saying, well, we think this is basically just a few European countries that are worked up. Most of the world is really enjoying the Qatar World Cup. And in fact, there are far more countries where homosexuality is illegal than where gay marriage is legal. That their values were actually more of the world as they saw it. It's just a very different kind of worldview. Now, how much the West has to accommodate that to try to create an even bigger coalition to push back against the countries that are security threats to us, whether we can do it, I think it's going to be really, really important theme for the next year. Do we care what the global South thinks? Does it matter? Are we going to have to care? Can we change their views? Those things I think are going to be really important in the year coming up.
Yeah, I think an excellent reminder that the world is larger than a shrinking West, and more people are going to have a vote. They already have a voice, but they're going to have a vote on what happens, and we'll be watching in 2023 to see where that goes. In the meantime, I really want to thank Karen DeYoung, Steve Erlanger, Gideon Rachman for today's contribution, for this year's contributions to World Review. It's been terrific having you and all of the other participants on this year. It's been an eventful year. I no doubt so will 2023. Hopefully more peaceful. Hopefully for everyone more healthy and happier than this year has been. But for the moment, I'm wishing all of you happy holidays, and we'll see you all back in 2023. That's it for World Review this week, and we'll gladly have you tune in back again next year. Until then, have a wonderful holiday. Bye-bye.